I was just surprised when I saw that Oleg Deripaska, who is one of the richest Russian oligarchs and closely tied with Putin, that all of a sudden he was in Japan actually at an economic conference, and lo and behold, he does an interview and he's saying that this war should stop immediately, that it is madness.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Alex Dibble, Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today we are joined by historian and Russia specialist Amy Knight. She worked for 18 years at the US Library of Congress as a Russia-Soviet Affairs specialist and was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The New York Times described her as the West's foremost scholar of the KGB. And her seventh book, which was released in June, was entitled The Kremlin's Noose, Putin's Bitter Feud with the Oligarch Who Made Him Ruler of Russia. Amy, thank you very much for joining Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we'd start by discussing the events this week. We've seen Russia attack two places in Ukraine that many people were not expecting them to, in particular, I suppose, Lviv, given its geographical location. I wanted to ask you, what was your assessment of those attacks? And was this Putin's retaliation, do you feel, for the Kursk incursion or not?
Like many people, I was really surprised and saddened by the loss of life, and it seems, and the destruction that was wrought by these two attacks. And it does seem that this is part of Putin's sort of general strategy in responding to the Kursk invasion, and also in trying to, further Russia's war aims overall in Ukraine. And so, in addition to the fighting on the battlefield in the Donbass, I think that another key strategy right now, which I think probably the goal is to undermine morale in Ukraine, undermine the leadership by these really severe attacks. I think that the Kremlin is kind of another way, in addition to the battlefield, of defeating its enemy.
Given Lviv's geographical location, so far in the west of Ukraine and relatively close to the border with NATO in Poland, is there a message being sent there as well, or is that purely incidental, do you think?
I doubt it's incidental, but yes, I think that, again, this is a sort of a message that Putin and the Kremlin are trying to send to the West, which is, this is getting really dangerous. And, NATO could get involved. And then, there are all these hints and sometimes threats that there are tactical nuclear weapons. If a line is crossed, then nuclear weapons could be used on Russia's part. So I think, the closer these severe missile attacks get to NATO's borders, this, of course, it's meant, as I said, to undermine Ukraine, but also to send a message to the West that, they better be careful about giving more weapons, more lethal weapons to Ukraine.
And the Kursk incursion, what's your assessment of how that is going at the moment? There have been various theories as to exactly why Ukraine may have launched it and how long they may remain over into Russian territory, whether they will withdraw or whether they will try to hold on to that territory. Do you think, well, firstly, what's your assessment of the motivation? And secondly, the success of that operation until this point?
Well, and my thoughts are hardly new, but I think that there were probably two reasons. One, to hopefully distract Russia and have some of the forces that they were using on the main front in the Donbass be diverted to the Kursk area. And secondly, I think that it was intended to sort of give to kind of give the Kremlin a surprise and maybe undermine their feelings of victory by taking this really pretty dramatic step of actually invading on Russian territory. So I think it was intended to kind of undermine the war effort in Russia in general, and then also to divert troops. And well, then there's a third motive, which is I think that Ukraine, that Kyiv and the Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, are, of course, as we all know, desperately trying to get, have the West continue to supply them with the weapons that they need. They'd also like permission to strike Russia, to strike deeper into Russia with missiles. And so I think that one of the arguments of the people who are casting doubt on whether further aid should be given to Ukraine, one of the arguments is that they're losing the war anyway, and we've got to have this peace. And so I think that Kyiv really wanted to show that Ukraine still had a lot of might and could do something. And this was a pretty daring attack.
Regardless of whether the attacks this week on Lviv and Poltava were in some way directly or indirectly a retaliation for that, given what you know of Vladimir Putin as a leader, as a person, how do you think he will have responded himself to the Kursk incursion, emotionally and politically?
Well, of course, Mr. Putin is very good at hiding his emotions. he's a real Iron Man. I think I'm sure it was extremely disquieting. And I also should say that because one of the biggest failings on the part of Russia and their security forces was that they did not foresee that this invasion was going to happen. And it was, it caused a lot of consternation in the security services and the military, because they really should have had, first of all, the FSB, which is their main counterintelligence service. Part of the responsibility that the FSB has with regarding Ukraine and the war is to be able to find out what's going to happen next and inform the Kremlin leadership and the military. So just as in February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the FSB had also made some crucial intelligence gathering errors, because the Russian military was completely unprepared for what a brilliant defense the Ukrainian military would make. And, the FSB had been telling the Kremlin and the Security Council, oh, yes, we can just Russia can just march right in there, and the Ukrainians will throw down all their defenses, and, in some areas they will welcome the Russians. And that was a big, big mistake. So that means that that there's a real severe problem with Russia's intelligence gathering and security services. And I'm quite sure that now we don't know what's happening at the top in the Kremlin and among the Kremlin elite. But I can tell you that they're probably, I don't want to say firings or dismissals or anything like that, although in the military we have seen some recently, not related to the Kursk incursion, but more to corruption. But I would say that, definitely there's a lot of, sort of post incursion discussion about what went wrong. And, this isn't good for the leadership right now.
In terms of how Russia thinks that the war is going overall, um, do you think the Kursk incursion has affected that significantly? And how do you think Russia feels the war is going at this stage?
Well, of course, when you say Russia, are we talking about the the leadership, or are we talking about the ordinary man on the street? I mean, I'm just saying they're kind of two 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 different audiences, or but first of all, as we know, Putin just recently at this economic conference in Vladivostok, he was like, "Oh, the curse, that incursion doesn't mean anything," and Ukraine thought that they were going to really hurt us by moving into Kursk, but nothing really happened, and it's no big deal, right? That's sort of the line that Putin and the Kremlin are taking on this. But and probably the most ordinary Russians who are in Moscow and in central Russia and so forth, they don't. They're probably not that concerned either. But of course, for the people who live in these regions and in the three regions along that border Ukraine, this has been a disaster. And a lot of the citizens are calling for more support. Not only did they have to be evacuated, all these people who were living there, but apparently they're not getting proper support, and there's a lot of chaos in how to handle this. So I would say that this is a real big deal, and Putin's efforts to downplay it and focus on the battlefront in the Donbass, I think is a bit of a cover up.
You recently wrote an article in which you described a choir of discontent, I think was the phrase, within the Kremlin. Can you expand on that? What exactly do you mean by that, and how significant is that choir?
Because Putin has drawn an iron curtain over Russia, and we no longer have the open media and all these discussions about what is happening among Kremlin colleagues and different factions. That's all a thing of the past. And so it's almost like the old days. And I was a Kremlin watcher in the old days under Brezhnev and his two successors. It was kind of like you had to look carefully to see what was going on by little hints. So I was talking about, I would assume, let me just take a step back and say that there was a big, as you know, after the elections, there was a big shakeup in Putin's government. And Nikolai Patrushev, who had been head of the FSB for a long time, he's one of Putin's, they've known each other for years, back to the days in Leningrad when they both worked for the KGB. Patrushev had been secretary of the Security Council and a very powerful guy. And the Security Council, the so-called Siloviki, the people who were responsible for the power ministries, and that would include the FSB and the Foreign Intelligence. Patrushev is very, very influential. So all of a sudden, he's no longer secretary of the Security Council, and he becomes Putin's assistant in the government, responsible for shipbuilding and so forth. I mean, so it's like it was a huge demotion, even though Putin gave him a little bit of a present by making Patrushev's son, Dmitry, who'd been the Minister of Agriculture, by bringing him in as a deputy minister. So, but that wasn't quite a quid pro quo. And so then he takes Sergei Shoigu, who is the Minister of Defense, puts him in Patrushev's place. Well, to me, this reshuffle, just in and of itself, right in the middle of this war effort and everything else that's going on, I think just by rational thinking, obviously, this created some unhappiness. And then along with this, Shoigu, and he has been running this war effort up until he was moved and is no longer Minister of Defense. Right after this, all these investigations, criminal investigations for corruption started. And several of the people directly subordinate to Shoigu have been implicated. And one of them just a couple of days ago was indicted or criminally charged. And there's a big scandal. So Shoigu has kind of been sidelined. You don't really see him too much. That's a whole nother story. So what I'm saying is that a backdrop to any signs that you see of discontent, for me, just the fact that there's been this reshuffle suggests that there must be, all is not running smoothly. Let me put it this way. Then I was just surprised when I saw that Oleg Deripaska, who is one of the richest Russian oligarchs and closely tied with Putin, that all of a sudden he was in Japan actually at an economic conference, and lo and behold, he does an interview and he's saying that this war should stop immediately, that it is madness, and that it's economically wrong, and so on and so forth. Now, Deripaska did criticize the war initially after the invasion in 2022. But then, he quieted down. He was obviously warned by the Kremlin. So then all of a sudden he's, mouthing off again. Now, one could say, well, that's just one example. But some of the Russia watchers, the Russian experts, political experts who write for the media, and particularly Echo Moskvy and so on and so forth, which I follow, they also noticed it. And the idea was that Deripaska wouldn't be saying this kind of thing if he didn't think there were other people who, agreed with him, other influential people. Now, since then, we haven't heard much, but, these sanctions, obviously one of the biggest problems for Deripaska is the sanctions, which have hurt him very much financially. And I mean, he's been trying in the West to fight these and so on and so forth. And a lot of the other oligarchs have suffered financially because of this, let alone just the complete loss of the ability to interact with the West and go on vacations and so forth. So I think that that just goes without saying that there are people, this is hurting people. Now, whether they have influence, enough to affect Kremlin policy, that's a different story.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think a lot was made at the beginning of the war, after Russia's invasion, of the sanctions that were placed on Russia very quickly, and the effect that would have on the oligarchs within Russia, and therefore the reverberations that would potentially reach the Kremlin. But we haven't really heard much about that, or at least it hasn't been in the news too much, from my perspective, in the last couple of years. But I think what you're saying is that the effects of those sanctions are still very much being felt, and it's still having a huge effect, even if we might not be talking about it every day like we were.
You put it exactly right. Exactly right. First of all, it isn't a lot of these oligarchs who have suffered because of the sanctions. People like the former Alpha bankers, Mikhail Friedman and Pyotr Avin, they both have huge mansions in the UK, and very wealthy and moving, I mean, vastly wealthy, moving around. Well, they have come under sanctions in the UK. I don't think yet in the United States. I think their company, Alpha Bank, has, but whatever. They have to be, I mean, clearly these sanctions, they've been open about it at the beginning, are really affecting them. But because they're still connected, they have to still, they still cannot afford to have the Kremlin angry at them. They have to be very quiet about taking this too far, if you see what I mean. And I think it's the same thing with Deripaska. In other words, yes, for sure, these sanctions have hurt them, but they can't go around talking about it all the time.
Sure. I thought we'd move on and talk a little bit about what's going on in the United States at the moment. So firstly, we've had the decision to indict and accuse Russia of trying to influence the 2024 US election. Media executives have been arrested and indicted, and a widespread campaign to influence the vote in November. What's your take on that? Is that something that you felt had been brewing for a while, and that it was only a matter of time before a move like that was made by prosecutors in the United States, or did it kind of blindside people?
There has been some discussion, of course, because of what happened in 2016 with Russian interference, which was pretty well documented, and it was a huge thing. We had the Mueller report, Robert Mueller, and there was a lot of evidence, even though none of it was directly. Even though Trump and the Trump campaign never really, it got to the point where they were accused of deliberately cooperating with the Russians. It was very clear that the Russians were making a huge effort to influence the U.S. population in favor of Trump. Remember the troll farm and Yevgeny Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency, and they were devoting huge efforts to propaganda on the internet in favor of Trump. So I think people sort of assumed that the same thing would be happening now. Reason being, and I think this is definitely the main reason that the Kremlin would be doing this, is that Trump has expressed doubts about supporting Ukraine. He said if he becomes president, the very first day the Ukraine conflict would end. Well, how would it end? It'd have to end with giving Russia a lot of concessions, right? I mean, there's just no question that the Kremlin favors Trump. So to that extent, I don't think it's a huge surprise. I think it was very interesting to me, the first kind of inkling that something big was happening was when I read that the FBI had raided the Virginia home of Dimitri Simes. And Simes, as you know, lived in the United States for years. He was a Russian immigrant. I think he came in 1973. And he was the editor of this publication called The National Interest. He was very closely tied with Nixon. And he's been, I mean, the whole time that I was living and working in Washington, he was like, he was part of this whole circle. And he had huge influence. And I'm sure, well, looking back on it, I mean, he was already, I can't say exactly to what extent, but he was definitely an influencer. That's the term that they're using now, on behalf of the Kremlin. And so when the FBI raided his home, I believe the news came about a month ago. Then it turns out that Simes had actually abruptly left the U.S. in October of 2022 and never has returned. So, it's like, there must be a reason for that, right? So I I guess in that sense, I wasn't so surprised to find out that the FBI had been conducting this wider investigation, because I was kind of waiting for some sort of something to be announced about Dimitri Simes. But getting back to this development with these two agents that were courting this Texas communications, this news agency, and so on and so forth, it doesn't come as a huge surprise. And I as you mentioned, I've written books about the KGB, and they've for years had this program of so-called active measures. And part of active measures is to spread propaganda that favors the Kremlin. So why they wouldn't do it and be doing it now? Of course they're doing it. But the big question, the interesting thing, is that the sort of the Trump, the pro-Trump people and the Trump campaign are starting to say that this has just been stirred up to cast aspersions. They're using the same argument that they did when there was this big discussion of Russian interference in 2016. And now they're saying, oh, the FBI just wants to, say that Russia's doing this because this helps buy the Harris campaign. So I guess it's become kind of a political issue, not surprisingly.
And the political issue is given a new twist when Vladimir Putin says that he actually wants Kamala Harris to win the election because she has this infectious laugh. And you think, yes, of course, he may be brutal, he may be evil, or whatever word you want to describe him. But the one thing you can't accuse Vladimir Putin of is having a lack of intelligence, because that seemed to be quite a clever comment.
I don't think it was frankly, that clever, because anybody who understands the situation sees it as just ridiculous. But and it's interesting. I went back and I've looked at Dimitri Simes. Back to him. I don't mean to obsess about him, but I think it's really pretty important, because he had a lot of influence in Washington. And now he has this program on Russia's Channel 1, which is different from RT, which has been connected with the scandal in the US. But they're all part of the whole propaganda network. They're all controlled by the Kremlin. Anyway, Simes just recently had on one of his programs, I just pulled it up and listened to it, and he's saying it's so obviously pro-Trump. And talking about how the war, the threat of nuclear weapons, and the US has to understand that continuing this to support Ukraine could really permanently hurt them. And I mean, so just to give you an example, all you need to do is look at Russian state-sponsored television and see what they're saying, and exactly what the Kremlin thinks.
We could talk for hours, no doubt, about all of this, but we've covered everything, I think, at least for the moment. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been fascinating to get your thoughts on all of this, and we hope to speak to you on Frontline again before too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.